we take action, you've sort of lost the momentum and the focus. So I think there's going to be a real effort to find out, who's responsible and to find targets for U.S. action very, very quickly. Not necessarily everybody, but you find the first one or two or three, you move after them and you keep on going on that. That's the best you can do.
We've been talking about how the American people are responding to this. You're there in Washington. You got the Washington Post we've been talking about with you?
Actually, it's the Washington Times, and this is a good one because if you think about this as a war, here's the image you got from the Washington Times. I mean, it looks like a picture you may have seen of the day after Pearl Harbor. All the papers, the Washington Post, all essentially look the same. I mean, there is a common thread here with respect to how the American people are seeing this, how the media is reporting this, which I think is a good barometer, that suggests that, again, Osama bin Laden or whoever has made a bad mistake, and the result here is going to be, perhaps, if we're all lucky, the first true war on terrorism.
Well, actually, I mean, that if you hold that headline up again, you see that that's literally a reference to President Roosevelt's statement that December 7th, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy.
Infamy, that's right.
And so they are drawing a clear comparison between the two.
That's right.
Dan Garay, awfully good to talk to you again, Dan. Thanks a lot. We'll talk again.
You too. Take care.
All right. As for what's going to happen now, as for how the country will absorb this, these are all difficult questions, and we will be going through it together. But Keith Morrison has some speculation. Let's listen.
In a moment, everyone knew things can't be the same anymore. And all across the country, as shock gave way to fear or anger or some other emotion, officials in charge of places and events shut them down. Suddenly, this is a country in which security means everything. Airports almost everywhere closed.
No airplanes will be leaving any of the airports in the United States until the ground stop is lifted.
Hundreds of people at airports all around the country crowded around TV sets, stunned.
It's unbelievable to me that people can crash planes in the World Trade Center and collapse on thousands of people. All the rescue workers outside there. It's absolutely devastating.
I don't think anybody in this nation is going to be able to sit down at dinner this evening or any evening from now on and consider ourselves to be completely safe. This is crazy.
The order to close for the first time, the entire national air traffic system came early from the Federal Aviation Administration. Many of those airports were evacuated. For how long? Who knows? At least until tomorrow afternoon, perhaps longer. No one's ever done such a thing before, ever.
I think our security is going to be so tight tomorrow that you're not going to believe it. It's going to take a long time to get everybody cleared. I mean, they're going to be doing hand searches. They're going to be doing all kinds of stuff. It's going to be the top level of security that we have tomorrow.
Markets, of course, just stopped. How could they operate here? Already, the financial loss has been in the billions. And, said UCLA finance professor Bradford Cornell, it will hurt for some time.
Investors are likely to get frightened. That will lead to a dramatic drop in stock prices.
And now, says Cornell, now that many institutions and companies will try to be more careful about security, we'll keep paying.
That throws sand into the gears on which our economy runs. It's going to make the cost of doing business greater, corporate profits lower, and that will depress stock prices and economic activity, even in the long run.
But that's for some other day. Today, nationwide, flags were lowered to half staff. Many states closed their public buildings, courthouses shuttered, trials postponed, popular landmarks locked up. Seattle's Space Needle, the Disney parks on both coasts, even the U.S. Mint shut down. The national pastime went the way of the national mood. Baseball commissioners announced that the schedule is off indefinitely. And for the Emmys, postponed indefinitely. Who felt like celebrating?
This weekend is not the weekend to put on this telecast.
In Texas, thousands of people flocked to a prayer vigil at Southern Methodist University.
Help us to make sense of senseless acts.
Psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Kingsbury said he expects a lot of people will want to be overcautious for a while.
I sense that we live in a safe society where we have good protections against external threats has been taken from us.
And a terrorism expert, Peter Chalk, who spoke to us over the phone because security kept him out of downtown Washington, told us overreacting towards safety might be a good idea for a while.
That symbolic message that's been transmitted across the world will have profoundly affected the image of the United States abroad, of invulnerability, and that the U.S. can be brought in to the very front line of this sort of attack.
And what wasn't shut down today, we are much more careful about guarding. The border with Mexico and with Canada closed for a while. Security around military installations like this one is at extraordinary levels, of course, also at atomic plants and the other sensitive places in the American infrastructure, which in the past had seemed impervious. No longer. The terrorism expert worries that in their fear and anger, Americans may decide it's time to end this country's famous openness. That would be a mistake, he says.
Without a doubt, I mean, one of the prices you pay for being in a democratic society is that you have to live with a certain risk threshold. The only way you could realistically counter a lot of these dangers is to have a closed society, but that's not what we're about.
America may be a little different after today, a little more conscious of external threat. As the psychiatrist said, we may have some new routines now.
Does that mean that there'll never be another hijacking or terrorist attack? Probably not. Does it mean the vast majority of us will feel safer? Definitely, eventually.
But not today. Today we interviewed the doctor in a park because security at his university office kept our cameras outside.
And just a little of information that is coming across now. The Taliban ambassador in Pakistan is saying that bin Laden is indeed in Pakistan, but the Taliban has taken away the means for such a well-organized attack. His activities are controlled by the Taliban. He can't speak on the phone. He has no internet access. He has no visitors, and therefore the Taliban will not consider turning him over to the Americans unless they come up with some clear evidence of his connection to the attacks, which they say they condemn. U.S. intelligence sources told MSNBC.com that FBI investigators have located the vehicle which apparently brought the terrorists to Boston's Logan Airport, where the two hijacked flights that destroyed the World Trade Center originated. This is confirming a report that was in the Boston Herald. They did find Arabic language flight manuals there as well. And a senior U.S. intelligence official is telling MSNBC.com that mobile communications from the hijacked airplane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh indicate that the three American passengers overpowered the hijackers but were unable to maintain control of the plane. They did indeed stop this plane from striking its main target, an act of extraordinary heroism if it's true, and there appears to be very clear evidence that it is. And so stands the reporting now. It has been a very hard day, and we are about to begin another hard day. The search and rescue teams are going through now in the emerging bright light of day, the rubble, hoping that they will find at least one more person. But as you look at the New York skyline, remember this: that is the sun that is rising there in the east. It will be yet another day for the United States. We will get through this day. We will not be harmed by terrorists. In the long run, this country is far stronger than its enemies, and that is exactly what is being shown at this point. I'm Forrest Sawyer. I'll see you tomorrow. Join us then. Stay with MSNBC.
There's another one. I'm taking a look. Oh my God! Oh my God!
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Went straight into one of the Twin Towers. It just disintegrated instantly. It was the most awful thing I've ever seen.
It straightened itself out and dove to the other side and crashed right in. An explosion was so terrific it looked like it had dynamite in it.
radio. Get out of the area. The second tower is coming down.
They tell you the second tower is
Yes, it's about to collapse.
I got fellow officers that might be trapped. Not trying to be a hero, but I think if you were in this position, you'd do the same thing.
There were people falling out of the sky. We were trying to get people away when the second collapse occurred, and I dove under a truck, so I don't know how I'm here.
I spent a year in combat. I never saw anything like this.
After the first tower collapse, we were back in there trying to bring people out. We knew the second one was about to come down, but we were lifting one person, and when it came down, we all just ran for our lives.
You could hear the rumble, and when you looked up, you could see the top of the building just crumbling. We all headed south, and you could feel the wind hitting in the back because as the debris hit.
Couldn't see, everything was totally black. You were just walking, hoping to find daylight. It was just unbelievable. I never seen anything like it in my life.
I'm just thinking about the firemen I see going up the stairs behind me and looking half of this building.
Today, we've had a national tragedy.
I've never seen anything like it. It literally blew itself into World Trade Center.
Just a short time ago, saw the tail end of a large airliner plunge into the Pentagon.
I was in the building because I was driving a friend. So I'm worried for her safety.
The World Trade Center is no more.
Wednesday, September 12, 2001, sunrise over Manhattan. A view both physically and psychologically forever changed. This is the day after the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history, and smoke still rises from the ashes of what were the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Hello and welcome to MSNBC's continuing coverage. I'm Chris Jansing here with Greg Jarrett, and rescue workers at what used to be the World Trade Center are describing an absolutely horrific scene. They are searching for possible survivors of today's terrorist attack.
Let's begin with some of the newspapers because they tell a very chilling story of what happened in the last 24 hours. Let's begin with the front page. USA Today, it's an act of war. It is a comprehensive account of what happened. Also, war seems to be the theme because here, too, the daily news, it's war.
Act of war as well. From the front page of the New York Post, World Trade Center destroyed, many dead. And on the front page of the New York Times, U.S. attacked, hijacked jets, destroyed Twin Towers and hit Pentagon in day of terror.
The human toll is unfathomable, and we are trying to give you the best information that we have, not just on what happened in New York City, but down in the nation's capital as well. Firefighters have yet, at this hour, to contain the fire that erupted when a hijacked passenger jet slammed into the Pentagon. So, this morning, very quickly, here is the latest. Authorities in Massachusetts have now identified at least 5 Arab men as suspects, one of whom was a trained pilot. The car they were driving reportedly contained Arabic language flight training manuals.
In New York City, meanwhile, rescuers combing the World Trade Center rubble, knowing that the death toll could easily be in the thousands. By some reports, there are fears it could go as high as 10,000.
Authorities say as many as 800 people could be dead just at the Pentagon alone. And as we mentioned, that fire is still not out.
The FBI says there were 3 to 5 terrorists on each of the 4 commercial jets that were hijacked yesterday. It's believed at least 1 terrorist on each plane was indeed a trained pilot.
The FAA has suspended all domestic flights until at least noon today, and no flights from other countries
will be allowed to land at American airports.
And many U.S. military installations across the globe are on the highest possible alert. This is known as threat level Delta. There are Navy warships stationed off both U.S. coasts.
It has been a staggering 20-some-odd hours, but let's begin in downtown Manhattan this morning, where a famed skyline is changed forever. Of the many dramatic and deeply disturbing images is this one, the World Trade Center flag tattered and purposely mounted upside down. That, as you know, is the international sign of distress. NBC's Alex Witt has been in the area since shortly after these attacks began. Actually, she is relieving Ashley Banfield, who was there since shortly after the attacks yesterday morning. Alex, good morning to you. Give us an update.
All right, good morning to you, Greg. Yes, I think haunted is really the adjective I would use to describe this area. The sun is just beginning to come up, so the light is helping firefighters in their rescue efforts. But as you said, thousands may be still missing, buried in the rubble of the World Trade Center. I'm about 4 blocks north of what's being called Ground Zero. If you can see my picture behind me, where that plume of dust, white smoke, lies, underneath that is where the rescue efforts are going on. This is still being categorized as a search and rescue operation. Also, southbound on the West Side Highway here, over my left shoulder, is where dump trucks, forklifts, cranes have been parading through continuously over the last half hour to get into that area and remove huge slabs of concrete, metal pilings, glass shards, door posts, everything imaginable that would come from a building that's been decimated like these have been here at the World Trade Center. And then up the outbound side of the West Side Highway, a continuous stream of dump trucks filled to the brim. Now, with regard to search and rescue operations, the majority of the firefighters on the scene since I've been here, which is about 11 o'clock last night, Eastern Time, we're doing just that, search and rescue operations. However, some company from Washington Heights, north of Manhattan, in the northern part of Manhattan, did speak with me and say they were actually fighting fires in what I believe is the Metropolitan Hotel. Not known the origin of those fires. We've had gas lines opened up here in the road of the West Side Highway, jackhammers piling through to get to where the gas line valves are housed, so that in case of emergency and there is some sort of a fire erupting from that, they can get into these valves and shut down the gas immediately to this area. Coming off of 48-hour shifts, I spoke with a group of Bronx firefighters who looked like the walking wounded themselves. They had that haunted look about them, and I asked them about their hopes for finding anybody alive in the rubble, and they looked at me rather blankly and said, there's just no way. It is too deep. They have each been assigned what amounts to about a 3-square-foot area, which they are painstakingly going over. Now, keep in mind, they were assigned to this area for 12 hours. What they had to first do was secure that area so they didn't become a potential victim themselves, and then go into the pockets that were created by these concrete slabs and metal pilings that landed as after those planes struck into the World Trade Towers, and then they collapsed upon themselves. Within those pilings and pockets, they're looking for survivors. The only thing they have found up until this point is body parts. We were told that one New York City fire chief and an assistant deputy chief are confirmed victims. Again, thousands still unaccounted for, including 200 of New York's finest firefighters. That is, at least 200. The number varies between 200 and 300. And speaking with firefighters that are leaving after long, grueling 12-hour shifts, they're saying to me, along the likes of, within the firefighter community, everybody will know at least one person who may have perished in this tragedy. We also came across medical personnel who had come in from Westchester Medical Center in Valhalla. After doing their own shifts yesterday morning, they were preparing to leave and head for home, got the call, volunteered to come down here. They were pulling double duty essentially all night, taking care of both exhausted and perhaps somewhat wounded firefighters, though thankfully we've gotten no reports of serious injuries to firefighters in the night hours. And in addition, they were donning hard hats and being asked to comb through the pile of concrete and rubble themselves. So they were leaving absolutely exhausted, and I said, will you talk to me live? May I get an interview with you? They said, we can't even speak about what we have seen. So it has been a very long, exhausting, very emotional night. Fortunately, not many onlookers since about 2 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. It really did wrap up in terms of people around here just trying to get a view of what's going on. Back to you two.
All right, Alex Witt live in downtown Lower Manhattan, ground zero of the World Trade Center. And Chris, after the two planes crashed into the World Trade Center Twin Towers, here is an account from the Associated Press. At the World Trade Center, the dead and the doomed plummeted from the skyscrapers, among them a man and a woman holding hands. Within an hour, both towers had collapsed. An EM worker said the initial reports indicated bodies were buried beneath 2 feet of soot on the streets around the Trade Center. A lot of vehicles, he said, running over bodies because they're all over the place. A National Guards member said, quote, I must have come across body parts by the thousands. I came across a lady. She didn't even remember her name. Her face covered in blood.
We also know from many reports that quite a few people who were trapped on the upper floors of both towers of the World Trade Center after those planes hit got on their phones, got on their computers, made phone calls, sent emails to loved ones saying they believed that they were going to die, telling them that they loved them, and saying goodbye. It was an unspeakable horror. And the number of those who died, of course, may not be known for days, perhaps much longer than that. But as the injured are removed, they're being taken to area hospitals. NBC's Rick Sanchez is at Bellevue Hospital, which is on the east side of Manhattan, and has the latest from there. Good morning, Rick.
And good morning to you, Chris. That story that Greg was just sharing about the couple jumping to their death holding hands really registers and makes us, I think, understand that this is much more a story about people than it is about terrorism or statistics or anything else. And throughout the day, we're going to be focusing on some of the people that are being brought to these area hospitals where we are covering the story. Unfortunately, many of them family members who are coming to learn that, in fact, their loved ones have died. Yesterday, we spoke to several firefighters, and they told us that they had heard that there was still some kind of contact, some type of phone service coming from beneath the rubble, and they were in tears as they described to me how desperate they were to try to get in there. There are still some reports today that there are calls coming from the rubble. Now, we don't know perhaps if this is an automatic dial system. There's no confirmed information as to whether firefighters have been able to respond to those calls, but that's the information that we have received thus far. Important to point out, this is still a search and rescue operation, not a search and recovery operation, although with that said, it is very difficult at this time for firefighters, as Alex was describing just moments ago, to be actually able to go into that rubble and find anything because there's just so much tonnage of debris that they have to go through. Some of the preliminary numbers we have here from Bellevue Hospital are 175 people treated. 1,000 people have been housed, given food and shelter. 500 military personnel are in the area helping, and the mayor's office has confirmed that more than 1,000 people have died. Those numbers at this point are obviously apt to change. At this point, it's very difficult to know how many people died. Suffice it to say that tens of thousands of people are in that area on a daily basis. The good news is the original blast from the plane happened before 9 o'clock in the morning, which would lead some to believe that many people had not yet arrived at work. There is a morgue set up here on 1st and 30th. We are following developments there as the bodies are brought in throughout the day. We expect that many more will be brought in. Some of the hospital doctors and officials that we have spoken to say many of the people being brought in thus far have been brought in for smoke inhalation throughout the evening yesterday. There are triage units that are set up at Bellevue, St. Vincent, and at Beekman hospitals, and all of those are up and running again this morning. Yeah, I heard you. Greg, go ahead.
Rick, it's Chris, and I'm just wondering what kind of systems are set up to help people who are still searching for loved ones who don't know if they're in the rubble don't know if perhaps they've been taken to a hospital?
Well, there are several numbers that have been set up, and they're being given to family members. Some of them are going through the Red Cross, and some of the others are actually going through city workers and city officials here. They've got a couple of numbers that they've just posted, and I'm going to go and read those to you right now because they've been posting the information on boards in front of the Arc at Bellevue Hospital. The Missing NY Fire Department hotline. This is for people who think that they knew fire officials who may be missing. That number is 718-999-2541. The Missing New York Police Department hotline. If you have a loved one who is in the police department, and many of them are still unaccounted for, 212-677-8238. And there are also, for missing relatives, general information. That number is 212-560-2730. You call those numbers, and they will direct you to the place where you probably need to go to talk to officials or perhaps some hospital workers. Chris.
One final question, Rick, and that is, I know that people were showing up all around Manhattan to donate blood yesterday, but the latest I read was that there's still a desperate need for blood, particularly O-type blood. Can you confirm that for me?
That is absolutely true. In fact, you're right. Yesterday, what they did was they turned people away simply because they couldn't handle the deluge of people who were showing up at the time, and because they were extremely busy at places like St. Vincent's, which is so near the scene, which is where people tried to get in to volunteer, not only for blood but for other services. But what they're saying today is that they want those people to come back. Call today or tomorrow, because there will be a shortage of blood, and they will need all the help that they can get.
Rick Sanchez, thank you very much for your continued reporting. We appreciate it. And again, a live picture on the left of your screen. It is sunrise, dawn over Manhattan, and in lower Manhattan, a large crane standing where the Twin Towers once stood, and smoke still billowing from the ruins, where hundreds of rescue workers are hoping against hope to still find people alive.
The rising sun silhouetting what was once the gleaming World Trade Center, standing tall and proud at this hour 24 hours ago, yesterday, but it is no more. The human toll and heartache is absolutely staggering, and it is not just New York City. Let's go now to the Pentagon itself, a target of attacks in Washington. We're hearing as many as 800 people may have died in the attack on the Department of Defense. NBC's Nora O'Donnell is there this morning. Nora, a couple of questions. I understand the fire is still raging there at the Pentagon. Is that true? And what can we expect from Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld today?
Greg, it has been almost 21 hours since American Airlines Flight 77 plunged into the Pentagon, ripping a 200-foot wide gaping hole in the Pentagon. And today, the Pentagon is still on fire. I spoke with a Pentagon official just a short time ago who said that there are still smoldering fires inside the Pentagon. All night long, all morning long, there have been water hoses pouring water into the Pentagon in hopes of putting out those fires so that a recovery team could get inside that rubble to go after many of the people that are believed to be buried in that rubble. However, they have been unsuccessful at putting out those fires so far. I just want to show you as well, Greg, the covers of the Washington newspapers this morning. This is the cover of the Washington Times. Infamy. It speaks for itself. The front page of the Washington Post this morning. Terrorists hijack 4 airliners, destroy World Trade Center, the Pentagon, hundreds dead. The Washington Post also has some fascinating details about just what happened in the moments before American Airlines Flight 77 plunged into the Pentagon, of course carrying 64 passengers. In the Washington Post today, they report that the passengers on this plane were herded to the back of the plane with knives and box cutters, the terrorists using those as weapons. Passengers on this flight included the wife of the Solicitor General, Theodore Olson, his wife, of course, Barbara Olson. There was also a Senate staffer, 3 D.C. school children, and 3 teachers on an educational field trip, and a University Park family of 4 headed to Australia for a 2-month adventure. They were all ordered to the back of the plane. According to the Post, they were all making cell phone calls to family before they died. Now, here at the Pentagon this morning, again, much of the effort is focused with the firefighters trying to put out this fire that is still smoldering inside the Pentagon. Officials say the reason that the fire is still smoldering is in part because of the massive hit that the Pentagon took. This jumbo jet that flew into the Pentagon was flying at 600 miles an hour, according to officials, with 6,000 gallons of fuel. That enormous amount of power that slammed into the Pentagon, say officials, means that the plane that once was is virtually unrecognizable. All there is a gaping hole. And the Pentagon, of course, has 5 sides to it. And the Pentagon also has 5 concentric circles inside the Pentagon. If you can imagine in your mind what a pie looks like, a big round shape, a Pentagon, the plane going into the southwest corner of it, it cut in about 3 of those concentric circles, very deep into it. That's why fire officials told us late last night that they believe as many as 800 people dead. Today, a Pentagon official refuses to confirm that number, saying that the branches of the military are currently going through and trying to account for their members, trying to account who is missing. When I asked this Pentagon official this morning, how could you not know who's unaccounted for? It's now been some 20 hours. The response of that Pentagon official was, there are 24,000 people who come to work at the Pentagon every day. We have just been hit by a plane. There has been a lot of confusion. They still don't know who's missing. That's why they can't account for how many people may be dead. Greg.
NBC's Nora O'Donnell at the Pentagon, thank you very much. And we want to play for you now remarks by former President Bill Clinton as he was traveling in Australia. Let's listen.
So I'm, for one, am determined to do whatever I can to be supportive, and I think all Americans feel that way.
Can you tell us what role, if any, you have?
No, I don't. You know, I'm going home early. This is as quickly as I can get back to New York. And if I can do anything to help the mayor or the police, the firemen, you know, we lost a lot of firemen and police officers there. You know, or in any way to support the work that will have to be done as we finish this rescue, I will do it. We don't yet know what the casualty numbers are for the military, and I've been trying to find out. I'm quite sure I know a lot of the people who were injured and perhaps killed there yesterday because it took a lot of the Army wing out. So I don't know enough to know, but I will do whatever I can. I've cleared my schedule, and if I don't do anything but help pick up bricks and give blood, I want to do that. I think that all of us need to do what we can to demonstrate to the world that, first of all, this is a human crisis, and we are grieving with and supporting the families affected. And secondly, we're not going to let it beat us. We're going to rebuild. We're going to go on, and we're not going to look the other way. And like I said, the country, I thought, was very well represented, our values, our ideals, and our interests by what the president said last night. I thought it was an excellent statement, and I think all of us should support it.
Have you spoken to the president?
No. I didn't think that it would be helpful to him, and so I didn't want to bother him. I just called and expressed my support and left a message because, you know, yesterday they had to, first of all, keep him on those bases until we knew for sure that the attacks, the series of attacks, seemed to be completed. I completely understand that. And then he had a lot of work to do. He had to get that talk together, and you know, these are decisions that he's making, and the rest of us should just do what we can to support the country and the people and the direction that was outlined last night. I think it was the right thing to do, and I'll do what I can to help in any way I can.
Mr. Clinton, thank you. We got to go. What sort of contact you had with Senator Clinton overnight? Did you have to get some?
Oh yeah, well, I talk to Hillary quite often, all night long, and I guess the last time I talked to her was probably 3:45 here, 1:45 at night there. But we talked a lot together. Obviously, you know, this is a terrible time for her, and you know, we're all just finding out who we knew, who were on the planes, who were in the buildings, and it's just beginning.
The words of former President Bill Clinton traveling in Australia. There, once again, you see the rising sun in the east, silhouetting the remains, the smoldering remains, what was once the proud World Trade Center. Firefighters, some 300 feared dead, police, dozens missing, and then, of course, in the collapsed Twin Towers, the search, the grim, gruesome search for bodies continues at this hour. It was expected some 50,000 workers in both towers. Unclear how many got out, unclear how many died in the explosions and the collapse of the World Trade Center. We'll continue to update you on that.
And while many New Yorkers and people across the Hudson River in New Jersey can see the changed skyline, this morning all of America is waking up to the grim reality that the strongest nation on earth is vulnerable to devastating attack. How could 4 U.S. jetliners be hijacked and 3 of them successfully hit their targets? Already, at least 5 Arab men have been identified as suspects in reports in the Boston Herald this morning, involved apparently with one of the 2 planes that left Boston's Logan Airport. Crediting unnamed sources, the Herald reports the suspects had no guns but used shaving kits and other carry-on luggage to smuggle knife-like weapons made up of plastic handles embedded with razor blades. Sources familiar with last night's developments said. That finding is consistent with reports of a flight attendant's cell phone call from one of the doomed airliners. Now, earlier this morning, Forrest Sawyer talked with Cosmo Macero Jr. He is a Boston Herald reporter.
Cosmo, I was just reading your article on the air here. Tell me a little more about this. Your sources are telling you exactly what?
Hi, Forrest. Yeah, we have law enforcement sources that essentially have confirmed for us tonight that what this apparently very significant development in today's events really emerged from an altercation this morning, or at least the information emerged from an altercation this morning in the central parking facility at Logan International Airport. A traveler had an altercation with at least 3 of these men over a parking situation or a parking space in the lot. Once he reached his destination, which we're unclear where that is, and learned of the terrible events of today, he notified state police that he had this altercation, and he actually had recalled details of this, apparently of this rental car, which we believe is a late model Mitsubishi with Virginia plates.
What sort of altercation did he have?
Some sort of a dispute over parking. There was a sort of a staring match, just a typical road rage kind of incident in a parking lot.
What was it about them that caused it to trigger his memory when he had heard about the hijacking?
I think it appears to be that they were of Arab descent in the vicinity of the airport, right. And that information led state police and other investigators. There's about 200 state police and federal investigators on the ground here to locate that vehicle. They have impounded it. They are searching it. They have found what appears to be potentially important evidence in that vehicle, and they have apparently tracked several suspects based on the evidence that they've developed from their investigation. Like you mentioned, Forrest, they have been able to develop information that these suspects apparently used some sort of makeshift knives fashioned from shaving kits and razor blades to gain control of at least one and perhaps both of these aircraft.
Now let's focus on the evidence. You say they found important evidence. I gather that includes Arabic language flight training manuals?
That's right. Our understanding from these law enforcement sources who we feel are reliable is that there were flight training manuals and manuals on operating aircraft in Arabic languages. There's another report that there may have been some videotapes seized also as part of this evidence on some carry-on luggage that may have been left behind.
Now, it's intriguing. A lot of people have been wondering how, using makeshift knives, they might have been able to force their way into the cabin and overcome the pilots, because all agree that no pilot would ever under any circumstances, fly his plane into the World Trade Center towers. Therefore, it must have been a hijacker who was guiding the plane. And you have some insight into how that may have occurred.
That's right, Forrest. Our law enforcement sources have painted for us what appears to be a very terrifying picture of the moments on that plane, or the time on those two aircraft, in which at least in one situation there were flight attendants and passengers who were herded into the back of the aircraft, apparently in an attempt to lure one or both of the pilots into the back of the aircraft, at which at some point they were able to take control of the aircraft.
Again, that was MSNBC's Forrest Sawyer speaking with the Boston Herald newspaper Cosmo Macero, who is breaking a lot of the news about the investigation into the suspects. At least 5 Arab men as suspects in yesterday's terror attacks. They wrought such destruction. Let me read from Associated Press. This just came out. Ferries are carting loads of bodies across the Hudson River as often as 10 minutes into the night. That, according to a Jersey City spokesman. 3 cab companies actually ripping out seats from vans to help carry the dead to the military ocean terminal in Bayonne, New Jersey. We have no estimate of the number of dead. Let's go to a news conference now at St. Vincent's Hospital, where many of the victims are in Greenwich Village.
In Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens, those hospitals received 42 additional patients, including 20 who were brought by barge over to St. Vincent, Staten Island. One of those individuals died at St. Vincent, Staten Island. Our paramedics were at the scene throughout the day yesterday. As you saw and continue to see, we are ready for what we hope will be additional survivors today. We are the closest trauma center, and thus if there are any miraculous recoveries from the wreckage, they will most likely be brought here. I'm going to ask Dr. Westphal to talk to you a bit about our paramedics and the work that they did, our ambulances, and the work that's happening in the trauma center, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Westphal, Associate Director of the Department of Emergency Medicine. Mr. Ackerman has mentioned the number of patients that we've had, the conditions, and the 4 deaths in Manhattan here. Our paramedics have had about 7 crews since 8 a.m. yesterday morning that have assisted Fidney EMS in obviously this massive undertaking of responding to critical trauma emergencies downtown. All of our crews have been able to participate and treat patients and move patients, and fortunately have not been injured or been critically injured themselves. We have in the emergency department right now all through the night a triple staff of nurses, physicians, physician assistants, and technical staff. The administrative senior management has been up almost all of them throughout the night, and we've been prepared and are awaiting victims from the site as well. We are, as I think Mayor Giuliani has said over and over, we are very hopeful, we are prepared, and we are expecting to work very hard to resuscitate victims as they're brought here and brought to other hospitals. I know that through the night I've been told by OEM and Fidney that other major hospitals in Manhattan have been similar to ourselves, and we've really decompressed the emergency department, so we're prepared for major injuries, major trauma, as we have had throughout the day.
I'd like to note a couple of important things. We want to first thank all New Yorkers and people from literally throughout the world who came to the hospital yesterday to volunteer their services. Doctors, nurses, just people off the street. We had over 800 people in line at one point in time to give blood. The mayor's office was kind enough to provide buses so we could bring them to other sites to donate that blood. Today, we are still in need of blood. All of New York is in need of blood donations. You should go to the New York Blood Center or the Red Cross, and we will provide those addresses to you. We can't stress enough that thanks to all of the volunteers, our neighborhood residents here in Greenwich Village. Behind my left, there are still tables set up where neighborhood residents are making sandwiches, bringing food. It's truly unbelievable, the outpouring of New Yorkers and the help that they have been. If anyone wants to give blood, we will provide that information to you. We've also received an inordinate amount of clothing through the night. We are very grateful for that, but we are really not in any need of any more of that right now. So we would just like to thank folks for that. It is very important to note that the trauma of this, from a psychological perspective, is going to be hitting New Yorkers more and more today. We particularly encourage parents to talk with their children. I went home for a few hours last night, and I have to tell you, at 2 o'clock in the morning, my teenage children and younger needed to talk. And it's very important that we encourage all parents to do that. In an effort to help with that, we have 3 mental health hotlines that are manned 24 hours a day. We will provide you with those numbers as well. There are many mental health crisis lines. We encourage all New Yorkers to take advantage of this. We have all suffered a terrible trauma in this city. We need to understand it and our feelings and to talk about it. So we encourage New Yorkers to take advantage of these. We have facilities in Westchester, Manhattan, and Staten Island that are manned 24 hours a day for this. We can take questions. There were no additional survivors brought here during the night. We did receive a number of firefighters, police officers, and paramedics, again, mostly with the corneal abrasions and literally lacerations on their hands. I don't know exactly what time it was, but during the night, we did receive the firefighters and paramedics.
Did you send medical teams down to Ground Zero?
Yeah, I'll let Dr. Westfall speak to that.
Did you send medical teams down to Ground Zero to
yes.
aid in amputations?
Well, I don't know about amputations, but to provide additional medical care, we did. We had about 2 crews of about a dozen doctors that went down through there to assist with treating patients. We also had a group, I believe, of about 4 physicians that went up to the Javits Center very late in the night to treat additional patients that were brought there, as they had requested help.
What's the status of the CCS?
I cannot speak for that. I'm not aware.
Sir, how would you characterize your efforts to try to get people from Ground Zero? Are you frustrated by the degrees there at this point? Are you able to get them out of there with the kinds of swiftness?
Speaking for our paramedics that had been there all during the day, along with Fidney's paramedics and all other hospitals' paramedics, and if I could just echo what Mr. Ackerman said, I can't believe the number of hundreds of vehicles and ambulances that have responded from the tri-state area and all the metropolitan areas. I've seen Jersey, Connecticut, I've seen Westchester ambulances that have all come. The thing I'd mention with the effort, I think from the very beginning, they have been working in the areas around the Trade Center and have not been inhibited. Obviously, for periods of time, our paramedics, I think all paramedics, were kept away from the buildings as they had a judgment that they were going to be coming down. So that was inhibited, but all through the night, they were assisting firefighters and other crews that were trying to extricate patients and then make judgments as to where they would bring them for care that was appropriate. Well, I think we would expect to see the victims that we would get today would probably have a number of problems besides the trauma and the injuries that they'd have, which would probably be more severe. We expect to see dehydrations and other complications of that having been underneath for probably almost 24 hours right now.
You talked about trauma. How's your own staff holding up, particularly since nobody's coming? You talked about trauma. How are they doing?
Well, our staff, from the standpoint of our trauma team here, ourselves...
No, psychological trauma.
Yeah.
How is your staff holding up, particularly since survivors haven't been coming?
Our administrative staff, nurses and physicians have been assisted all throughout the 24 hours by our Department of Psychiatry, by our pastoral care, by our priests and sisters that have been down there, not just for the patients, but for our staff entirely. And we've had a couple of individuals that have needed time to sit down and talk with them and to cry with them, and that's happened throughout the day.
You haven't heard it?
It's just important to note, too, that a number of our nurses and physicians are married to firefighters and police officers, and they worked throughout the day yesterday and the night not knowing where their loved ones were. We're very grateful that all of our paramedics that were at the scene and physicians and nurses are okay. We did lose an ambulance. One of our ambulances was crushed in the debris, but our hearts certainly go out to our colleagues in the fire department and in the police department and all of the other victims.
At this point, you haven't heard about anybody else who might be coming?
Just one at a time, please.
At this point, you haven't heard about anybody else who might be coming?
We have not gotten any information about new victims coming to us. Sure. We have in our system, entire system, 2,600 beds throughout the city. Yesterday, we were able to transfer some of our patients to other sites, discharge patients appropriately, and then we opened up as many beds as possible here. We still have bed availability here. Sure.
Yeah, of the patients who came in, again, over 361, right, we had, again, as was mentioned, we had 5 patients expire, 2 who came in what we call traumatic arrest from the injury, needing CPR coming in the door. Those patients both expired in the emergency department. A firefighter came in with major injuries and chest pain and went to the operating room and expired there. And then we had another individual come in during the night, during the morning hours with severe burns, who ended up expiring upstairs in our surgical ICU. 5th person was, as Mr. Ackman mentioned, was brought to Staten Island, St. Vincent's, and expired there. I can tell you we had 50 major traumas and major injuries, and I can tell you, unfortunately, I happened to be here in '93 when we had the other World Trade Center disaster. I can tell you then, throughout the city, there were 10 deaths from that disaster, and here we had the first victim. That time we had 1 death the entire time, and you know, you folks will know better than I the hundreds and perhaps thousands of people that may die from this. There were major smoke inhalation patients. There were also, though, of the 50 victims, probably close to 30 victims had fractures of extremities, as well as we had a number of head lacerations, a number of people that required CAT scans during the night for major head trauma. But a myriad of injuries that you would expect from collapsing buildings and things related to that.
We're just going to take a couple more questions, and we'll talk individually. I think that as time goes on, there certainly will be more and more concern, but we will be on the ready, and we know that everyone downtown is doing all they can to get everyone out.
So they'll work the crowd if
we haven't gotten any specific instructions on what to expect today, but as Dr. Westphal said, anyone who's pulled out, we need to be concerned about dehydration and the kind of crush injuries. We're going to be making ourselves available to speak to you. That's all we have for now. We will update again mid-morning. Thank you.
6B.
And so again, as we watch the sun coming up over Manhattan, officials at St. Vincent's Hospital, which is the major trauma center nearest to the site of what was the World Trade Center, talk about the ongoing efforts to treat those who were injured. They confirmed that 5 of those who were brought to their hospitals have died. And you may have heard some questions asked about some of the doctors who were actually sent to the scene. Let me read to you from a report in the New York Times this morning. In a desperately needed dose of hope during a long night of frustration, 2 men were pulled alive from beneath 30 feet of debris near the World Trade Center. But even that small victory came at an awful price. Doctors needed to amputate the leg of at least 1 man in order to free him. In addition, this report says 6 or 7 firefighters huddled for 4 hours in an open space beneath the twisted remains of 1 World Trade Center were saved. And I think that said it best, a desperately needed dose of hope. in the midst of what otherwise is an unspeakable tragedy.
Chris, there are so many stories of pain and suffering, the anguish of agonizing deaths that so many people witnessed. Let me just read a couple of them. John Exissa said he ran outside and literally watched people jumping out of windows of the very first building, then the second explosion. He said he felt the heat on the back of his neck. Donald Burns was being evacuated from the 82nd floor of one of the towers when he saw 4 people, he said, in the stairwell, quote, "I tried to help them, but they didn't want anyone to touch them. The fire had melted their skin, their clothes were tattered." There are so many victims. Let's turn now to MSNBC's Jeannie Ulm at the Chelsea Piers on the west side of town. Jeannie, as I understand it, good morning to you. You are at a makeshift morgue, is that correct?
Well, that's what they're planning for, Greg. Let me just back up a little. We've been out here on the West Side Highway all night long, and let me tell you, it's been nonstop traffic with emergency vehicles racing down toward the World Trade Center, and they're coming back. They're going back in with heavy equipment. It's been like this all night long. Now, directly in front of me is the Chelsea Piers. For folks who are not familiar what this is, it's a sports and entertainment complex. It's a huge complex, and right in front of it, there are about 50 ambulances I can count right now. They've been out here for several hours now. We're told that they housed about 1,000 emergency employees, volunteers, some who came as far as South Carolina, throughout the New Jersey area, New York, Connecticut, even Massachusetts. Now, yesterday, they used this complex as a makeshift triage, and we're told that they treated about 175 people here. Most of those people were the less seriously injured, mostly for smoke inhalation and cuts, and they have all since been released. But the most chilling part about this, Greg, is that even though all the focus is downtown in the World Trade Center, the grim reality is they know that a lot of people will not have survived what happened yesterday. And we're told from one of the coordinators that they plan on using the ice skating rink here at Chelsea Piers as one of the makeshift morgues. Now, at this point, none of the bodies have arrived yet, but the city is preparing several locations throughout the area for what they're anticipating is the overflow. In fact, over at Pier 94, that is usually a place that they use for trade shows. Well, all night long, police have secured that facility as well in anticipation that that area as well might be needed for a morgue. And the mayor of Jersey City yesterday, when I was out at Liberty State Park, he said there again, they're also preparing a morgue out in the park there. But again, back here at Chelsea Piers, they have not had brought in any bodies at this point. But again, the coordinator says that if necessary, they are going to be using the ice skating rink as a morgue. So it's definitely a very sobering thought this morning.
All right, Jeannie Ulm, thank you very much. As we continue to look at the smoldering remains of what was once the World Trade Center, it is about 46 minutes past dawn here on the East Coast, maybe a little bit more than that. There is no way that we will know, perhaps for days or maybe weeks, the full extent of the fatalities. I mean, the 4 airliners that were hijacked alone, you're talking about 266 people. The Pentagon, perhaps as many as 800 fatalities. Firefighters feared 300 dead. Dozens of police officers are missing. And then you have literally thousands of people who may have either been workers or visitors to the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, not to mention number 7 that also went down in this attack. And the newspapers, 3 of the major newspapers here in the East, the Post, the New York Times, the Daily News, it's war. They all have the same headlines, and that underscores a new poll that shows in clear terms just how Americans feel about it. There you see it on your screen. 86% of Americans that were polled say this is an act of war against the United States. 87% the most tragic news event of their lives.
Yeah, and no doubt that local newspapers all across the country where you are saying many of the same things. They're weighing in on the tragedy. We've been checking in on their editorial pages. Let's take a look at the Cincinnati Enquirer. There were no enemy markings on the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon. They were our own commercial airliners, apparently loaded with innocent Americans, hijacked and used as horrific weapons against other innocent Americans. Make no mistake, this is war.
And from the Daily Oklahoman, quote, "This is a time for the nation to draw closer to God, a time to pray for the peace of New York City and Washington, as well as the peace of Oklahoma City and Jerusalem, and all the places where terrorism has struck fear in into the hearts of good people. The Los Angeles Times, we don't have this on the screen, but let me just read it. God have mercy. War has come, America roused, the wrath cometh. Through how many warnings have we slept? How many terrorists have we goaded? On how many continents?
And I just took this off of the Associated Press because as the questions about why are asked, there will be very large questions and very small ones. This surprised me. Most Americans don't know that passengers are allowed to carry knives on board commercial airliners. This is the guideline that's published on the Federal Aviation Administration's website. It says knives are allowed with blades up to 4 inches. And when I think about it, I have seen a number of people going through metal detectors at airports, and on their key ring they have a Swiss Army knife, and they put it in a little plastic bin and it goes through the other side. They walk through and they collect it. These were small knives. That's how these terrorists were equipped.
For more now on how this series of attacks could have been pulled off, how in the world, we're joined now by MSNBC military analyst Ken Allard. Ken, good morning. I want to read to you, let's begin with the New York Times. And here is their editorial. This is William Safire's editorial. What well-financed terrorist organization under what country's secret protection slaughtered so many Americans? Why? With $30 billion a year spent on intelligence, couldn't our FBI, CIA, and NSA prevent this well-coordinated two-city attack? Ken, you've had less than 24 hours to think about this. I bet you have an answer.
Well, Greg, I wish I did, but those right now are precisely the right questions to be asking. You know, this was an extraordinarily sophisticated, well-organized, well-timed attack. You know, it's interesting, too, because the fact that, you know, the weather yesterday in both Washington and New York was perfect. So you have to give them credit for the timing of this as well as the execution of it. That does not happen overnight. And I think that there are many people that I've talked to in the intelligence community who are now asking the question, what degree of state support is also out there? Because I think it takes three things. It takes a support network in the United States, it takes a privileged sanctuary overseas, and it takes, we think, some degree of state support to be able to do these kinds of things. Those are the right questions. Unfortunately, at this moment, Greg, we simply don't have the answers.
Well, let me be specific. U.S. intelligence intercepted, according to Senator Orrin-Hatch, communications between Osama bin Laden, the well-known international terrorist, his supporters discussing the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. That makes sense to you?
Yeah, it does. The thing that concerns me, though, is the fact that our intelligence community is always very, very good, seemingly, at picking up these things after the fact. That's not intelligence. That's history. Intelligence is the ability to predict what is going to happen, and the very tough questions that are going to be asked in the aftermath of this, as they were asked after Pearl Harbor, is what did the intelligence community know and when did they know it?
Well, Ken, $30 billion is spent on intelligence a year. How could we not know it?
Well, actually, you know, an awful lot of that is the technical intelligence, the satellites, the eavesdropping stuff, and in fact, that's exactly what they're offering to us this morning. That's not how you get inside those networks. The war of the network is the human intelligence war, is the counterintelligence war, and we have not emphasized that. An awful lot of that $30 billion goes toward those very, very high-tech surveillance systems, which are really not capable of detecting the kinds of things that went on yesterday in the United States.
Well, if it is Osama bin Laden and he has thousands of followers, how is it we cannot penetrate that network?
Because it is less of a, it's less of an organization, more of a family. You almost have to be born into it. It is something that has got very, very strong ethnic ties, religious ties, as well as its clandestine apparatus. That's a very, very tough target to penetrate. And you know, Greg, you don't do that overnight. You don't suddenly say, hey, this guy is now a threat to me and I'm going to try and penetrate him.
Well, but we've known for a decade that Osama bin Laden is the #1 known terrorist in the world. He's been indicted for some 200 murders. You know, look, it wasn't yesterday that we learned about Osama bin Laden.
No, it wasn't. And again, in the aftermath of this, those are precisely the questions to ask, to say, look, why is it that you did not know? Why was it that you tried to penetrate this organization and failed? I mean, Greg, I'm not underestimating the difficulty of this target, but as you were talking yesterday, we have had persistently pointed out to us, most recently by this National Study Commission chaired by 2 former senators, that we are vulnerable to this. And the thing that has to be asked constantly is, to what degree has our intelligence system tried to target these guys. What have they tried to do? And if it hasn't worked, why not?
Yeah, you're referring to the Rhetoric study, which basically said an imminent terrorist attack is going to be massive and soon. In fact, I'm holding their study in my hands right now, but I also want to hold the Washington Post's comment by Henry Kissinger and ask you about it. He says, this is an attack on the territorial United States, which is a threat to our social way of life and our existence as a free society. It is therefore has to be dealt with in a different way, with an attack on the system that produces it. What system is that?
Well, the system that he is talking about is the system that produces these networks of terror, and that's exactly what I was referring to a moment ago. Not only do you have a support system in the target countries, and unfortunately that yesterday involves the United States, but it also involves a degree of state support. It also involves a privileged sanctuary. The privileged sanctuary is Afghanistan and in other capitals where these people have been tolerated and where that support network has been allowed to exist.
Well, what is your intelligence telling you? I mean, you're a military analyst. You've been doing this for a great many years. I have enormous respect for your knowledge of this. You and I talk on the phone all the time. Is it the ruling Taliban in Afghanistan that has been harboring Osama bin Laden?
Well, there's no question about that, Greg. And again, they were the first to say, well, you know, he was not involved with this. And that's a very, very logical thing for them to say. But I think the suspicion has also got to rest, you know, on other countries that are in that region, Iraq and Iran. You remember back in June, the Attorney General of the United States, talking about the Khobar Towers indictment, talked about the fact that there were some unindicted co-conspirators, by which he meant the Iranians. Okay, we have taken no action. We said the same brave things then after that disaster that we're saying right now, and I think the rest of the world is waiting to see if this time we really and truly mean it.
Last quick question as we continue to look at the silhouette sunrise of what was once the World Trade Center. If there is a retaliatory attack, and that seems certain, Ken, what will it look like?
Well, you know, Greg, that's going to be the question. The last thing in the world that you do in a case like this is to do the same kind of pinprick attacks that we saw after the 1998 embassy bombings. This has got to be maintained. It's got to be systematic. It's got to be inflexible. It's got to be inexorable. I would argue that it also has got to be massive and disproportionate. But you don't do that until you've got some good targets, and that is right now the task in front of the intelligence community.
All right. Ken Allard, you're going to be with us throughout the day. Many thanks, Ken. We surely appreciate it. Chris?
We're now beginning to hear the last words of some of those who lost their lives in Tuesday's air disaster, just minutes before United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in Western Pennsylvania. Mark Bingham called his family from aboard that doomed plane.
He said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that.
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
I got on the phone, Mark, and he said, hi, Mom, this is Mark Bingham. Giving me his last name. And he said, I want to let you know that I love you. And I'm flying. I think he said I'm in the air. I'm calling you on the air phone of the airplane.
In his seat.
I presume so. He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, well, who are they, Mark? And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, I don't know who they are. He became distracted there as if someone was speaking to him, and he said, it's something to the effect of, it's true. And then the phone went dead.
There are so many stories like that. All of us here knew Barbara Olson, the commentator. She was on our air many times. She is one of the people who was killed in one of the plane crashes. She was on American Flight 77 from Dulles. She is the wife of the U.S. Solicitor General. She called her husband, Ted Olson, twice. According to reports, a spokesman for the family said the last words that she asked her husband, what should I tell the pilot to do? Also lost in the plane crashes, and we're beginning to get some information. David Angel, he was the executive producer of the NBC show Frasier. Garnet Ace Bailey, he was a director of pro scouting for the Los Angeles Kings hockey team. Over the years, his involvement with the NHL, his teams won 5 Stanley Cups. A number of business executives. The toll is tremendous, but How did this all happen? We want to recap for you briefly the chain of events of yesterday morning. In a matter of an hour and 10 minutes, 4 commercial jetliners would crash. A New York City landmark would be no more. It is missing from the picture you're looking at now. The U.S. is changed forever. It began at 8:50 a.m. Eastern Time. American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles crashes into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. About 20 minutes later, another Boston to Los Angeles flight, hijacked in midair, crashes into the North Tower. That is United Airlines Flight 175. 20 minutes later, a third jet, American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington, bound for Los Angeles, crashes into the Pentagon. Back in New York, the intense heat and jet fuel are too much for the soaring Twin Towers. They collapse. And the terror is not over yet. 10 a.m., United Flight 93, which had left Newark Airport bound for San Francisco, crashes into a field in rural Pennsylvania. There are reports that the plane was on a collision course with Camp David.
I want to read again the heartbreaking story of several accounts of people who witnessed all of what you just recited unfold, including the initial explosion in the first tower of the World Trade Center before the second one was hit. The Associated Press reporting that many people on the ground saw the dead and the doomed plummeting from the skyscraper, among them a man and a woman who apparently jumped out a window to their deaths holding hands. Then, after the collapse, EMS worker Luis Garcia said the initial reports indicated that bodies were buried beneath the 2 feet of soot on the street around the Trade Center, soot that still exists as we look at the smoldering remains of the World Trade Center. Here's a quote from him. "A lot of the vehicles are running over bodies because they're all over the place." And then this word from a National Guard member: "I must have come across body parts by the thousands. I came across a lady, she didn't remember her name, her face covered in blood."
It is 7 a.m. in the east, 4 a.m. in the west. Our coverage continues.
Today, we've had a national tragedy.
I've never seen anything like it. It literally blew itself into World Trade Center.
Just a short time ago, saw the tail end of a large airliner plunge into the Pentagon.
I was in the building because I was driving a friend. So I'm worried for her safety.
The World Trade Center is no more.
It is the day after the attack on America, September 12, 2001 now, and there you see the silhouette of Lower Manhattan, where once stood, gleaming and proud, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, struck by hijacked jets. They collapsed yesterday. Thousands are missing. The search is on.
This is the first time in nearly 3 decades that the sun did rise over New York City, and the World Trade Center was nowhere to be seen. There are massive rescue efforts underway, but it is hope against hope. The devastation is tremendous. Good morning. Welcome to MSNBC Live and our continuing coverage. I'm Chris Jansing here with Greg Jarrett.
Now, the Twin Towers collapsed yesterday, as we mentioned, by being rammed from hijacked commercial jets. Then there was the third jet that smashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A fourth crashed into rural Pennsylvania. Let's get you caught up on the very latest. In a telephone interview with a Palestinian journalist, suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden said he's ecstatic about the deadly attacks, but he claims he had nothing to do with them. U.S. intelligence officials, in the meantime, say they are virtually certain bin Laden masterminded those deadly attacks. Authorities in the nation's capital say the death toll from the attack on the Pentagon could be well over 800. Firefighters still trying to extinguish that blaze. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says, despite the carnage, the Pentagon will be functioning today. Further north in New York City, rescue workers face the very grim task of digging through what used to be the World Trade Center. Authorities fear the death toll could run well into the thousands, but there are some miracles to report. Within the last few hours, firefighters have rescued several people pinned underneath fallen debris.
Now, at what remains of the World Trade Center, firefighters and emergency workers have spent this entire night searching through the smoke, through the rubble, for any survivors. And as we've told you, it has been a painstaking search. Their efforts have been very infrequently rewarded. For the latest, let's go to the scene and NBC's Ashley Banfield. Ashley, good morning.
I'm having trouble hearing you, but let me get you up to speed here on exactly what the situation is now, about 22 hours since the first remnants of the World Trade Center were flying down onto the streets below. There are still some fires burning. You can see the smoke that's still billowing behind me. The problem is the firefighters said last night, they've said throughout the night, and they've said even this morning, they can't get to the actual fires. There's too much debris. There's too many blocked roadways. It's just too difficult to get to the actual fires that are burning, and they've got bigger problems on their hands, and that would be obviously the people who are potentially still buried. You heard reports yesterday of cell phone calls coming in from beneath the rubble. We haven't heard any reports of late that those calls are still coming in, but clearly the effort changed last night from scouring the tops of the mounds of rubble to actually starting to take some of the larger debris. And we've got pictures from the recovery efforts this morning showing some of the heavy machinery getting in there, the front end loaders, the dump trucks, trying to get some of the heavy material and debris off of the pile so that they can start to look below. A couple of other things to get to you information-wise from authorities is that many of these buildings are still unstable, so there is a great concern for a lot of the safety crews, security crews that are in there. They've got to be very careful. We actually saw just a few moments ago, coming around this corner here, an NYPD cruiser with 4 police officers who were wearing flak jackets. Not exactly sure why flak jackets would be worn in a situation like this, but potentially there could be still small explosions. In any case, we are being told that there is still a great deal of concern. One other thing I wanted to tell you was just before we came on live with you, Chris and Greg, a couple of transit authority officers walked by me this way, and they told me directly beneath where I stand, there is a train, there is a subway train that is stopped. It's a pump train because part of the actual subway has collapsed beneath the World Trade Center area. And because of that collapse, a lot of the water main breaks and a lot of the firefighting water have actually doused and drowned some of those tunnels. So what they've done is they brought in a pump train that's parked directly beneath where I'm standing, and they're trying to pump out a lot of that water that's been coming in. One other quick note as well, we wanted to just make mention for those who are just waking up who may not have heard late last night, 2 police officers, actually they were officers with the Port Authority, were pulled alive from this rubble. The condition at this point unknown of those officers, but those were the 2 bright spots in a very dismal day, a very difficult night. The weather is cooperating today. It's cold here, a little chilly in Manhattan, but certainly no heat and no inclement weather so that rescue workers can still continue with their work. And last night we witnessed about 40 different dump trucks lined up and ready to go, and about a half dozen semis lined up and ready to go into Ground Zero to try to start hauling out debris. At this point, it's very quiet in our evacuation route here. We haven't seen a lot of vehicles coming out, just amazing numbers of emergency vehicles going in, very little coming out. Back to you, Chris.
NBC's Ashley Banfield at the scene of the worst terrorist attack in U.S. history, and there, as she has been for a good bit of the last 22 hours. Greg?
Airports all over the country could reopen sometime this afternoon, but it's expected actually to take several days before air travel is back to normal. NBC's Colleen Dominguez is live in Los Angeles at LAX Airport, where 3 of the doomed planes were scheduled to land there yesterday. Colleen, good day to you. What's going on there?
Good morning, Greg. Well, it's eerily quiet out here at LAX. Of course, as you just said, airports here and around the country remain closed. I can tell you that we do see LAPD helicopters making perimeter checks, but usually this time of morning we will have passengers arriving, getting ready for flights, but of course that's just not happening, and that's why it's so eerie to be here and see what is actually not happening here. It'll be at least 5 hours before officials reassess whether to open up any airports, whether to put any planes back in the sky, and I can tell you that's probably a very optimistic time frame. It will be some time before we know if we have full air travel back on track. As you said, 3 of the 4 doomed jetliners were bound here for LAX. They were in fact 2 American airline flights, Flight 11 from Boston to LAX, Flight 77 from Washington, D.C. to LAX, and United Flight 175 also from Boston to LAX. Now, terrorist experts believe that those planes may have been targeted because they were transcontinental flights and therefore would have been filled with fuel. Now, when airports do reopen, there will of course be beefed up security. It will be hours and hours before passengers make it through the maze of security that is expected to be set up at airports around the country, and it'll be a huge logistical task about when and how to put the full fleets up, if indeed they do put full fleets of planes in the air, or if it's just limited service. Now, yesterday at LAX, when they closed the airports, officials did talk about what they expect to happen in the next few days. Here's what someone had to say.
The FAA in Washington is coordinating with the airlines to exactly figure that out and how they're going to get this recovery system back and get the air transportation system back in service. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time, but the FAA is working with the airlines. That is their responsibility. We're prepared to assist in any way that we can to get passengers to airplanes and to get the airplanes out of the airport.
Now, of course, full passenger manifests have not yet been released, but we are learning some of the names of people that were on those doomed flights headed for Los Angeles, including TV commentator Barbara Olson and the executive producer of the sitcom Frasier, David Angel, and his wife, Lynn. Very jittery nerves out here in Los Angeles as we watch the events unfold on the East Coast. Life probably won't be back to normal here or anywhere anytime soon. Greg?
Colleen, I got a flurry of emails from folks out in Los Angeles yesterday where I grew up, and they had indicated that beyond LAX there were a lot of other areas that were either restricted or closed down, including some high-rises. Is that true? And if so, are they going to be open today?
That's right, Greg. Yesterday, a lot of federal and state buildings were closed all over Los Angeles. In fact, by midday, it was really like a ghost town here. Most people went home from work. The freeways were empty, which is something we never see. Roads into the airport were closed. A lot of businesses shut down. People just went home and watched television. Today, they say they expect life to get a little more back to normal. Schools are open, will be open. Businesses will be open, and they expect people to go back to work and try to have some semblance of a normal day.
All right, NBC's Colleen Dominguez live in Los Angeles at LAX Airport before dawn there. Thanks very much. Chris?
Meantime, this morning, the nation's capital is on high alert with armed soldiers on some street corners and the Pentagon still smoldering after yesterday's crash. President Bush made it back to this city to address the nation last night, and we are just hearing from NBC's Bob Kerr, he has put this into our hot file, that President George W. Bush will meet with congressional leaders at the White House. That is now planned for sometime between 11 or 11:30, probably in the cabinet room. It's likely we'll be able to bring at least part of that to you. Also, the president arrived at the Oval Office shortly before 7 o'clock this morning, so he's been in the Oval Office for about the last 15 minutes. Obviously, his major advisors all at the White House as well.
Let me just read very quickly another hot item here. Doctors and nurses at area hospitals working throughout the night to help thousands of casualties of the attack. Late into Tuesday evening, ferries were bringing loads of bodies across the river as often as every 10 minutes. Cab company workers ripping out seats in passenger vans in order to help transport the dead to the military ocean terminal in Bayonne, New Jersey, just across the river there.
The response has been extraordinary. I know, for example, that yesterday all of the hospitals in northern New Jersey directly across the river from Manhattan went on a state of alert. They canceled all elective surgeries. There were quite a few surgeons, nurses, other trained personnel who were going over to Manhattan, which remained a very dangerous situation, offering their services. I'm just reading again in our hot file that the American Red Cross has now opened 12 shelters in New York City. They always, in these sorts of situations, do extraordinary work.
The international repercussions are being felt. Let's listen now to British Prime Minister Tony Blair.
To the Islamic faith. The vast majority of Muslims are decent, upright people who share our horror at what has happened. People of all faiths and all political persuasions have a common cause: to identify this machinery of terror and to dismantle it as swiftly as possible. With our American friends and other allies around the world, this is the task to which we now turn. That is the conclusion of my statement. I will take some questions. Before I do so, I just wish to make this clear to you. There will be questions at this juncture that I either can't or, frankly, won't at this moment answer. In particular, about the nature of whatever action the United States of America may take or the support they may call upon in respect of other countries. With that caveat, I'm happy to take some questions. Yes, Andy.
This may be one of those questions, Prime Minister, you can't answer, but there have been official and semi-official comments from the United States about Osama bin Laden's group being the likely culprit for this. What is the British view of that? Do we have any intelligence view about where these attacks have come from?
I won't comment on the identification of who is responsible at this stage, but obviously this is something that is under close consideration by our agencies here as well as other agencies around the world, in particular those in the United States of America. Yes, sir.
Mike Lee with ABC. Prime Minister, to what extent, and I know you don't want to be specific, but are there no limits to which you will cooperate with the United States government in pursuing the terrorist? And given the possibility, the real possibility that Britain could become a target if you either endorse or insist in reprisals, to what extent do you think the British public is prepared for that?
As I said a moment or two ago, Mike, I don't think it is wise to speculate on what the nature of any American response would be to this act of terror, or indeed what support they may call upon from this country or other countries in making that response. But I want to make one thing very clear indeed. This was not an attack on America alone. This was an attack on the free and democratic world everywhere. And this is a responsibility that the free and democratic world have got to shoulder together with America. And at this time of...
That's British Prime Minister Tony Blair making his comments this morning, and you heard him state that this is an attack really on people all around the world. I'm just looking at some of what is going on around the world this morning. There is a terror alert, literally, globally. Malaysians feared the worst when a bomb threat triggered morning evacuations. Thousands of people called out of the world's tallest building, the Petronas Twin Towers in Kuala Lumpur. There was another threat that cleared a skyscraper that houses offices for IBM and a bank in Malaysia's largest city. There were warnings from the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta. So all across the world there is a heightened alert about terrorism. Here in the United States this morning, about 15 or 20 minutes from now, President George W. Bush arrived in the Oval Office, a daunting task in front of him and his staff today. NBC's Bob Kerr is at the White House for us this morning with the very latest from there. Good morning, Bob.
Chris, good morning to you. Well, it was a late night here, and the day began for President Bush shortly before 7 in the Oval Office. The first thing on his agenda this morning, we were told, would be a meeting with the National Security Team. Of course, yesterday that was expanded to include other cabinet officials as well, who could report to the administration on what their agencies were doing in the way of relief and search and rescue and that sort of thing. The White House has announced, in fact, a blood drive right here at the White House and at the Executive Office building next door today, too. So trying to pitch in on the humanitarian end of things. The president also expected today to meet with congressional leaders at some point later this morning. And this will begin what many are seeing as a real test and a different test, an unwelcome test, really, for this new presidency. This is a president who now has to not only try to do the very hard job of trying to rally the nation's confidence, he also has to identify security threats, assess the security situation. He also has to see if he can somehow isolate the perpetrators of this or any governments that may have aided and abetted in this attack. And so there is an awful lot on his plate. His presidency changed very, very dramatically yesterday when these events happened. Last night, the president spoke to the nation from the Oval Office. Let's hear a little bit of what he said.
Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature. And we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could.
Now, the president also went on in his speech to say something that everyone is considering very important. It was a hint, nothing really specific, but a hint about what is being considered or what may be considered in the way of options in terms of retaliation for the attacks. The president said at one point last night, "We will make no distinction between terrorists and those who harbor them." Let's hear a little bit more now from President Bush.
The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
That is considered a key statement, perhaps the key statement from the president's speech last night. What was interesting is we had a briefing from the president's press spokesperson, Ari Fleischer, just before the president went on the air. And one of the questions he was asked is whether the president, like the American people, are angry, increasingly angry about what happened yesterday to this country. And what Ari Fleischer said is the president is very, very even-keeled. He doesn't go high and low, hot and cold. What Ari Fleischer said is the president demonstrated all day yesterday a steely demeanor, but a demeanor of resolve. The president didn't want to really spend too much time last night speaking about options, even though there is intelligence information that this administration has that clearly points in the direction of Osama bin Laden, or at least those affiliated with Osama bin Laden in terms of these terrorist attacks. Last night, the president mainly wanted to set a tone that addressed the victims. Let's hear a little bit more of last night's speech.
Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
The president and some of his top aides clearly wanted Mr. Bush to make that speech from this place, from the People's House in the center of Washington, D.C. yesterday, even though throughout much of the day there were legitimate security concerns about the president's well-being and whether he was indeed a target of what some thought could be a concerted attack on the United States and a continuing attack on the United States with the president as a target. There are reports this morning that the president, that it was even being considered that the president would stay last night at a secure military facility in Nebraska, but instead he flew home and got to Andrews Air Force Base sometime around 6:30 Eastern Time last night. The pictures were stunning in a way in that Air Force One flew and on each wing there was a fighter jet accompanying. Those were the visible fighter jets. There was obviously other air cover that was harder to see. So a new day for the Bush administration and a very, very complex set of challenges ahead, Chris.
And the scope of the immediate problems dealing with this crisis obviously is enormous, in some ways unprecedented, Bob. And yet there is other business that the White House, that Congress was dealing with before this terrible tragedy occurred. Obviously, the economy, billions of dollars in damage being assessed so far. International markets have been reacting badly. Will there be other business that can be carried out? What will Congress be doing?
Well, Chris, I think the president's spokesman said it himself last night. He said that, you know, the president has a pretty extensive travel agenda this fall. He was prepared to go talk about a lot of domestic issues. But clearly now, in terms of White House officials, the focus is on what happened in this country yesterday in terms of the terrorist attack, and that is going to be the president's focus. But all sorts of questions come up, Chris. There will be lots of questions about the intelligence community and whether they were adequately prepared to deal with this, whether they dealt with it in the proper way. That's something the president is going to have to wrestle with. There will be budgetary implications of this. Not to be cynical about it, but one of the things that the president has been saying all along is that the only reason he could see that would ever justify busting the budget caps or digging into the Social Security surplus would be some sort of emergency. This obviously would qualify depending on how they wanted to spend the money. And there will be a debate over increased intelligence spending, how to spend more money on defense. The president's desire for a missile shield, a missile defense will come into play because a lot of people will argue this is not the threat. The threat isn't missiles coming at us from rogue states, although it may well be. They'll say the more immediate threat is this kind of thing, these kinds of terror attacks. How do you best prepare to defend against those and retaliate for them? So is that the way the money should be spent? So these kinds of questions will certainly color the debate from now on.
And let me ask you about the small picture, Bob. What's it like on the streets of Washington this morning?
Well, this morning it looked a little bit better to us than it did yesterday, Chris. It's still a bit of a ghost town flavor. There are streets around key buildings that remain closed off. And a lot of workers in Washington, the whole federal government workforce is on what they call liberal leave. So a lot of people won't be coming into town. A lot of schools in the area are out, and it is very unusual. You see police or cordons of police cars roaming the streets. I myself didn't see soldiers. Other people say in certain parts of the city they saw soldiers, but I think that was more over toward the Pentagon, which you might expect. But it seems a little more natural than it did at points yesterday.
NBC's Bob Kerr at the White House, as always. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Greg.
Let's take a look once again at the scene in Lower Manhattan. This is a live picture now after dawn, and there you see the smoldering remains. The most devastating terrorist onslaught ever waged against the United States when knife-wielding hijackers crashed two airliners into the World Trade Center, toppling the twin 110-story towers. And there you see the aftermath. They are no more. Another building, World Trade number 7, 47 stories tall, also collapsed. It is anticipated that the death toll will rise into the thousands. The search for bodies and survivors continues at this hour. And too, in Washington, the Pentagon, the symbol of America's military might, took a very sharp hit yesterday from one of the hijacked jetliners, a third one. But Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who stayed at his post at the Pentagon throughout the disaster, says the building will be in business today. People will be at their desks, even though the military's casualty list is still being tallied. For more on that, let's turn now to the Pentagon and NBC News correspondent John Palmer. John, good morning there. Is the fire still burning?
Yes, at first light of dawn this morning, Greg, you could see the water being played on the top of the building some 22 hours after that American Airlines 757 crashed at 600 miles an hour into the west front here of the Pentagon. Officials say as many as 800 people may have died, including the 64 people who were aboard that hijacked aircraft. There are dogs teams working the debris in the wreckage behind me. They also have listening devices looking to see if perhaps someone has survived this. But the fire was so intense, burning for more than 12 hours furiously here. They don't have a great deal of hope, but always they say we're keeping up hope and we're going to search and do what we can today. For many hours yesterday, the intense heat of the fire kept rescue workers from going through the entire area that was burned and severely damaged by the aircraft. This morning, we're learning a little bit more about what happened on that hijacked American Airlines Flight 77. The Washington Post reports that the passengers aboard that plane, all 58 of them, were herded toward the back of the aircraft. Those that had cell phones were told to call their loved ones and tell them that they were about to die. The original intended target apparently was the White House, and at the last minute the plane took about a 270-degree turn and flew in just over here to the left, shearing the top of a tree off, and then plunged right into the side of the Pentagon. Last night I talked with Governor Jim Gilmore of Virginia, who went directly to that area near where the helipad is here at the Pentagon, and he said he was looking for some kind of a crater, but there is no crater over there. The plane, at full force of 600 miles an hour with 30,000 pounds of fuel, plunged right into the building, not at street level, but a story or so above the 5-story building there. Again, there have been flare-ups of the flames throughout the night. The roof of the Pentagon is a wooden structure, so there's been this burning, but they think they've about ready to knock that fire down so they can really get in and search the debris in earnest fairly shortly from now. Greg?
All right, ABC News, John Palmer live at the Pentagon. Thanks, John. We'll be coming back to you a bit more as the fire continues to burn there. Well, John mentioned Governor Jim Gilmore. He joins us now live from Richmond, Virginia. Governor, thank you for taking the time. I know it's been a busy less than 24 hours. As John mentioned, you did visit the Pentagon, the scene of that disaster. Tell us a bit more about what you saw, what you learned.
Well, the first thing that I needed to do yesterday was to make sure that the people of Virginia were secure. I think that it really needs to be remembered that when this began at 9 o'clock at the New York attack, we really didn't know what we had before us. We didn't know whether we would have further attacks anywhere else in Virginia. We had to be secure. We activated all of our emergency operations, our National Guard, coordinated with the Navy and the Army and federal authorities. But once that was secure through the morning and it was clear that the attacks were complete in New York and in Northern Virginia at the Pentagon, then at that point I did fly up to the Pentagon in order to look at it myself. I expected, actually, and had heard that there had been some landing or some cratering at the front of the building, but that wasn't the case at all. There were actually fire hydrants completely untouched right at ground level. So what happened was this plane went directly into the side of the building at full force and drove its way through several of the rings of the Pentagon. It created, of course, a great deal of death and destruction. I think that today all Virginians and all Americans are very saddened by this and saddened by the loss of life. I lost 2 friends that I found out about just when I was up in Northern Virginia yesterday. But we're also going to be resolved as Americans. I think Americans will draw together and draw strength from each other and look inward and draw that strength. But then Americans are going to look outward, and the people who did this are not going to be happy when Americans look outward.
Governor, you're one of 50 governors in the United States. You wield a great deal of influence and power. What should America do?
Well, I'm chairman of a national task force, a commission on terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and local responses. 3 years ago, we began this commission. It's been through now 2 years and 2 reports, and we'll be completing our last report just in several months from now. We concluded in the very first year that the chance of a conventional attack of this nature was a very high probability. At the end of the second year, we reported to the last administration that there was no national strategy. One had to be created, one that included in state, local, and federal authorities all together, particularly local responders. We made very strong recommendations with respect to our intelligence community. They need to be freed from some of the arbitrary restrictions that were placed on them several administrations ago. There need to be a great deal of work done in order to create a national strategy that can deal with these kinds of issues. I'm very pleased that the President has handled this crisis the way that he has. He's been calm, resolute, direct, compassionate, and of course, as you know, he's assigned the Vice President now on the strength of many of our recommendations to go forward and to create a national plan. I just wish this had been done years ago.
Well, and Governor, we do spend about, I don't know, what is it, $30 billion a year on intelligence, somewhere in that neighborhood. I mean, in your mind, are you wondering, how could this have happened to us?
Well, we've, of course, gone over the last number of years to a great deal of satellite and electronic communications intelligence, and that's all very sound and correct, as a matter of fact. But we need to be focusing also on human intelligence. Back in the Carter administration, a decision had been made. We could not, for example, recruit terrorists into human intelligence. That's wrong. Terrorists ought to wake up every morning wondering whether or not people within their own organizations are reporting to our intelligence organizations. We need to do a better job at that, I believe. I think our intelligence organizations are doing an excellent job, but they need to be released from many of the restrictions that have been placed on them.
Governor Jim Gilmore of Virginia. Governor, our condolences to you and the people of Commonwealth of Virginia who have lost so many. Thank you very much.
And we have correspondents really all across the country covering this story for us, including Suzanne Malveaux, who is in Pennsylvania, near the site of the crash there. Ashley Banfield continues near Ground Zero, near the World Trade Center. Also in Manhattan, Rick Sanchez on the east side of Manhattan. He has been checking in with the folks at Bellevue Hospital for us. Thanks again to all of you for putting in these long hours. Suzanne, let's begin with you, and what is the situation there in Pennsylvania?
Well, certainly the scene is not as dramatic as what we've seen out of New York and Washington, but certainly no less tragic for the relatives of the victims here. We were here overnight. It was a quiet night. Basically, state troopers and police who are here on site. You can see the command post that has been set up, making sure that they keep the integrity of the site. It is a crime scene. They made at least 3 arrests from folks who were coming by who wanted to pick up a souvenir or take a close look. And they said, look, you know, you're only allowed to be about a mile away, which is where we are located, from the crash scene. There was no search for survivors. There were no mourning family members or smoldering embers. Basically, it was very quiet, and what you saw was just a huge crater about 10 feet deep, 15 feet long in a V shape. What we understand from investigators is that it came down hard at a 45-degree angle, that it was a high-impact crash. And as a result, there is very little visible debris. When you see it, it just looks like the plane just completely ate up into the ground there. One of the officials on the site saying that they didn't have a piece of evidence that was larger than a phone book, so they are going to have a really difficult time today. It was about 7 o'clock this morning that we saw a caravan of police officials, NTSB, United officials, FBI. There are going to be about 150 who are going to go through the task here of actually going through, sifting through the debris, through the evidence, and also recovering these body parts. What we understand, and they are piecing this together, is that this United Flight 93 from Newark going to San Francisco, officials believe that it was on track, and when it entered the Cleveland airspace is when it was diverted, when it was overtaken by terrorists, and that the air traffic controllers at the tower warned the local officials at the Johnstown airport that the plane was flying much too low and that it was coming in at a very strange angle. Officials here actually tried to communicate with the plane. They were never able to do that. One of the working theories from senior administration officials is that the terrorists certainly didn't mean to land here, but were headed to Washington. And if it weren't for some of the courageous acts of passengers who may have intervened and distracted these terrorists, that we might be dealing with a lot more deaths.
NBC's Suzanne Malveaux in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Thanks very much, Suzanne. Now to the side of the Twin Towers. NBC's Ashley Banfield has been there for much of the time since the first plane hit the first tower. Good morning, Ashley.
Chris, I just want to step aside for a moment, and I want to give you a shot that a lot of New Yorkers and tourists to New York would come and see. Down this street, down West Broadway, where you see that smoke, is where the 2 World Trade Center towers used to loom. They took up almost all of that blue sky and smoked area that you're seeing. It is just remarkable that it's absolutely empty right now. The results of that, as we continue to watch emergency vehicles, Army, not only that, but sanitation units and transit units coming through this area to go into the center area where it all emanated from. is just remarkable as well. There's been a huge collapse of the subway area, of the tunnels right beneath where I am down to the World Trade Center. We just talked to a couple of transit authority workers who said the World Trade Center subway station is gone. Completely gone. Not surprising when you see the site behind me as well. Not only that, but the tunnels are completely flooded from here up. About 15 to 20 blocks, they said, are flooded right up to platform level, so everything is shut down, obviously. Very few trains are working in New York at this time anyway. They've got a couple of routes open for people who need to get where they're going, but you just can't get anywhere down beneath about 34th Street, Manhattan. You can't walk anywhere unless you have press credentials, or if you're an emergency personnel or vehicle, you can't get beneath about 14th Street or so. A couple of other things I just wanted to tell you about. One of the construction workers who volunteered his time just came through here a short time ago. He was exhausted, he was filthy, he was sweaty. He asked us if any of the bridges or tunnels are open so that he could get home. And we told him that you could get out, but you probably couldn't get back in. And when we told him some of the stories that had developed overnight since he'd been on the scene, and when he told us some of the things that he'd seen since he was in there lifting debris, he started to cry. It's just really a remarkable scene, just absolute utter exhaustion and emotional trauma that a lot of these personnel have gone through. We also talked to two other workers who were helping pull debris off of a walkway between Battery Park City and the World Trade Center. They said the entire walkway collapsed and collapsed below onto at least 3 fire engines. At that time, there were firefighters who were manning those stations as well. There were bodies that were seen after that as well. At this point, they're trying to take that walkway up and off that debris and obviously try to search for more bodies, but we've already heard the missing count of New York firefighters at upwards of 300 and city police officers at over 30 at this time. That's a lot lower than the original count of 79 last night, but still far too high. Another couple of things I wanted to let you know about. We told you Army troops had been coming in as well. Marines are on site. We've also seen National Guard units here, and also Army construction units are in the vicinity as well. A lot of the debris that's being carted away includes some of the cars in the area. Some of the shelled out, the burned out cars circle the area that they're still trying to get to. So some of those burned out shells of cars and of police cruisers and of fire trucks are being loaded onto flatbed trucks and being taken out of here so that the debris is more accessible. This has been one of the greatest problems as we watch some of the helicopters flying overhead. The airspace has been extremely quiet over here, save for a couple of helicopters. But as you see a lot of that smoke, there are still fires burning. The problem is that they can't get to them. There's also some incredible instability with some of the buildings that are still standing. A resident just came out of here who says he lives only a block away from the World Trade Center towers where they once stood. He said there's a building in the vicinity, it's about 50 floors high, that's leaning at this time. It's still on fire, and he said the firefighters were telling him that they're just trying to figure out a way to bring that thing down, which is one of the stories we heard repeatedly, albeit yesterday that was the story that was being repeated with regard to the World Trade Center Tower number 1, number 2, number 5, number 6, and number 7. It's just a remarkable story as we watch some of this debris now being hauled out. Look at these dump trucks. These dump trucks are taking out some of the twisted metal and scrap that we can see. We counted at one point about 40 dump trucks lined up last night off the vicinity, guessing about 10 blocks or so over to the east. We had a quick tour in the back of a New York City Police Department cruiser. They took us into the dead zone. They took us all around the central area where the 2 towers fell. You've seen the pictures. It's hard to describe. A ghost village teeming with firefighters and confusion, with paramedics, workers covered in ash and debris, grown men crying and sitting on curbs trying to get their breath, trying to cool down, trying to get some of the ash out of their necks. I can still feel remnants of it from yesterday. It's extremely itchy. This is another scene we've been seeing a lot of. New York City sanitation trucks that have been trying to hose down a lot of the streets because one of the big problems in this area is the immense amount of ash and dust. We're about 10 to 15 blocks at this point from the actual ground zero, and I can't tell you how many blocks this ash is scattered for, but it gets extremely thick about 3 blocks south of us. And of course, it's anybody's guess as to whether there's asbestos or glass shards in a lot of that air. So We've been seeing some of these sanitation trucks just trying to get the dust level down. It's the first time we've seen it, though. I think this is the first opportunity that they've had to actually come out and do this, because this route has been far too busy with emergency vehicles all throughout the day yesterday, all throughout the night, and this morning. It's a lot quieter, though, at this particular area right now, Chris, as obviously the main work is to just try to dig through the remaining mounds of rubble. I don't know if you heard this report late last night, but after we took our tour in the backseat of that cruiser, we were privy to the site from 1 block away of Building 2 of World Trade Center Tower number 2. It's absolutely remarkable. It was a mound. It was only a mound. There was nothing left standing, and the mound was probably as high as 2 stories. It was simply a mound. There was nothing left. It was just unbelievable, Chris.
Heartbreaking stories. Ashley Banfield, thanks very much.
We want to show you something you may not have seen before. The world seems to have seen the second plane that hit the South Tower of the World Trade Center yesterday while the first one burned. You may not have seen the first plane, the first hijack strike. Let's watch and listen. And there it is. A plane was flying low. It caught the attention of some firefighters who happened to be working out on the street, and an amateur videographer who then turned his camera skyward and caught the hijacked jetliner filled with people purposefully crash into the North Tower, 110 stories above the ground. And then, of course, that tower came tumbling down. It was really about 15 minutes later, as we were watching it here live on MSNBC, that the second plane then rammed the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And there you see the collapse of that South Tower.
And a lot of people have questioned, how could this be that these towers are built with such structural integrity? Well, as we've mentioned before, all 4 of the planes were chosen because they were on cross-country flights. They would have a maximum amount of fuel in them, and there is nothing, no kind of steel that can withstand the heat that was caused by that burning jet fuel. And very quickly, it just essentially became a house of cards.
There is the second plane as it rammed the South Tower of the World Trade Center, and there you see the huge orange fireball, the intensive heat that continued to build over the course of more than an hour. And what happened is it began to melt that thick steel and concrete, and then one floor began to dip and crash into the next floor, and like a house of cards piled on top of each other all the way down 110 stories. Then it happened again with the other tower, the North Tower, as we see that one come crashing down. That is how structural engineers have described the mechanism of this terrible, terrible fall. And remember, as we're looking at that videotape, maybe thousands were trapped in it. Are there any survivors? They're looking for them now, but mostly bodies, body parts strewn everywhere. Let's go to Rick Sanchez, standing by at Bellevue Hospital, where victims are being treated. Rick, good morning. Give us an update.
Okay.
Rick, you with us?
Oh, I'm sorry, Greg. We just had a hospital official come up and give us some instructions on what he's going to do. I understand that you're going to be allowing us to go inside in a little while and get some pictures in there as well.
We'll allow you to go to our south lobby, and we will be giving you folks hourly updates as we get them.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to set the scene for you as to what's going on here, Greg. We're outside Bellevue Hospital, as we may have mentioned. It's one of several facilities that is being used. This site of Lower Manhattan has starting to come back to life this morning as people start coming out into this area. Let me show you the entrance of Bellevue Hospital over here, and you'll see that security is on high alert. Everyone that's coming into this area is being checked, certainly more so than is customary. About 2 blocks down the street from where we are, there is a morgue that is operational at this point. I should tell you, it's not the principal morgue. The principal morgue is being used is one in New Jersey, and the bodies that were recovered throughout the night were ferried through the Hudson back to Jersey City to an Army morgue that has been set up there. That is the primary location. The other location, obviously, is this one here at Bellevue that is still being used, and officials say that there has been some activity there throughout the night as well. Let's go over some of the numbers that they shared with us just a little while ago. Officials came out and told us that they've had 230 people here as patients. 75 were firefighters, 21 were police officers. They admitted 40 of them, and that one of them died. The one that died, interestingly enough, was a firefighter who had arrived at the scene at Tower 1 when someone jumped from the building and landed on top of him. That's how officials here at Bellevue Hospital are saying. One of the hospital's doctors, in fact, described the scene, saying that that is how he lost his life. He was DOA when he arrived here at the hospital. Other figures that we can show you in pictures, because information has been coming in, as you know, from St. Vincent's Hospital as well, which is about 10 blocks about 10 to 15 blocks from here, and I have some numbers and some pictures we can show you from there. There, we're told there have been 175 people treated throughout, 1,000 people have been housed, and there are 500 military personnel who are in the area who are helping as well. We should tell you that perhaps one of the most sad events that we have witnessed here so far, and it's one that apparently has happened throughout the evening. Two young ladies, one 18 and one 20 years old, showed up here a little while ago, distraught, in tears. They hadn't slept throughout the night. They wanted to know where their dad was. They said their dad was in one of the towers, and they haven't been able to find him, and they're going from hospital to hospital asking if anyone has seen his name on their list, and they left here with no news. And they're hoping that somehow they will learn something. At one point, they heard a report that there were still people that may be trapped inside, and they became somewhat relieved. Some of the hospital workers here who are designated in this area to come out periodically and meet with family members to try and give them information say that they have met 75 to 100 people throughout the night who've been coming here desperate, asking the very same question. In some cases, they've given them names, but for the most part, they have none. I'm Rick Sanchez, reporting live.
All right, Rick, thank you very, very much. The fatalities, the airline alone, 266 people were on board those 4 hijacked aircrafts. The Pentagon, maybe as many as 800, perhaps upwards of that, lost their lives there. Firefighters, some 300 are feared dead. Maybe as many as 30 police officers, and of course, as we continue to look at the silhouette of the sunrise here in lower Manhattan, the smoldering remains of the Twin Towers, you're talking about thousands and thousands of people, perhaps, as Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, who's going to be holding a news conference very shortly, about 10 minutes from now, said it will be too many to bear. As I turn to Chris Jansen, Chris, you got a note, the fire company near where you live wiped out?
That's what my understanding is. When I had called to my building yesterday, which is in Midtown Manhattan, so many of the people were crying, and there is a fire station just a few doors down from where I live, and I understand that they were among the first respondents to the scene. They are, many of them, well and highly trained EMTs. It's one of those buildings, so we certainly hope that's not true, but there are a lot of people grieving because they, being the first respondents on the scene, got caught in the collapse of World Trade I, World Trade II. So we'll continue to keep you updated on that front. We should also say that Rick Sanchez was at Bellevue. There are 170 hospitals in New York City, and all of them have been called into service, and throughout the metropolitan area, unsung heroes as well in the Washington, D.C. area, and where the plane went down in Pennsylvania. They deserve our prayers and thanks for the incredible work that they're doing. And there are so many families grieving today, although certainly many more, we hope, counting their blessings because their friends and relatives were spared by these tragedies. Tom Lautefield was one of those working in the World Trade Center yesterday morning.
All you could see were papers and smoke just flying through and around the plaza. And we looked up about maybe 10 or 15 floors up, and the whole wall was blown out, and it was filled with flames. And everybody was just like in awe. We had no idea what it could be. And suddenly our 2 managers in the office They came screaming in with an urgency that I've never, ever heard before in anybody's voice, saying, "Get out, get out, get out, get out." We had gotten down to about the 50th